I'm Neeta Misra, the executive editor for public policy at Business World magazine, the oldest business magazine in India. And this is Policy Matters. We have with us today Purnima Menon, senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Purnima holds a doctorate in nutrition. Welcome, Purnima, and we're excited to discuss nutrition. Purnima, tell me a little bit about what got you interested in nutrition. You hold a doctorate in nutrition.
Yes, I do. So, my path to doing what I do today, which is in, sort of the intersections of nutrition and public policy, didn't start with an interest in nutrition as a path towards work on public health and public policy. I actually initially studied nutrition in my undergrad because I was really interested in the restaurant and food industry. But, as I just got really fascinated with the topic. And then when I did my master's, I sort of began to understand the public health and policy related ramifications of it. And then had an opportunity to intern with IFPRI in Washington, D.C. way back in the mid-90s. And then I think from there was no turning around after that. It was very clear that that was a space that was very, very interesting and engaging for me. I also sort of really, beyond just the links with public policy, I think the idea of research and science and knowledge supporting effective policy, I think is what really keeps me ticking and keeps me grounded. So, that's where I am today. And it feels like I'm going to be here for a while.
Great. So it's July 2022. What does zero hunger mean for you today?
Wow. I think if you had asked even a couple years ago how we felt about, moving towards the zero hunger goal, I think you would have, maybe 3 years ago before the pandemic, I think you would have heard a lot of enthusiasm, a lot less worry. We had at that point in time tremendous interest and commitments towards the global goals. There was resourcing going towards those. There wasn't sort of a pandemic that affected the economies of large countries, and there certainly wasn't a war that affected, literally the availability of some of the critical food commodities that feed the world. So July 2022, I find is a very challenging time for the world as we think about, what does zero hunger mean as we look towards the SDGs. My colleagues and I and many, many other people who are, advocating for stronger policies, for more resources, for more attention to issues of hunger, food security, and nutrition are deeply concerned about the path that lies ahead of us. It's, I don't want to say perfect storm, but it is a confluence of a whole range of factors that is really going to affect the world's ability to meet the zero hunger goal at this point in time. So I think there's a lot of concern. The few things that give me, glimmers of hope or optimism, I guess, are the fact that the world recognizes the challenges. Certainly world leaders, the leaders of countries, people recognize, politicians and society as a whole recognizes that hunger and food insecurity are deep challenges. The question is always, are the responses that are necessary going to be effectively resourced, effectively implemented? Are we going to be able to reach the poorest, the most vulnerable, the ones who are most at risk? But I think we have no choice, right, but to continue to advocate, continue to do what we do, and take a bit of a whole of society approach. And in that, my job and the job of people at the Institute and the network of institutes that we work at is to understand the problem, to do the research that helps us, characterize how big the challenges that we are likely to face, to advocate for the right sets of solutions, learning from what we've learned in other periods of crises, and really to work together with governments, with funders, with everyone who's interested in making change happen, to kind of keep our eyes on the ball, and that's, for me, that's the kind of stuff that we do as researchers: keep our eyes on the ball, keep our eyes on the data that's coming through, try to understand what's going on the ground, try to understand if solutions are reaching people, try to understand if the problems are getting better or getting worse, shape-shifting. So yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us as we look forward to 2030.
So going back to your point about the data, I think in 2019, the Social Progress Index, the SPI index that comes out, was predicting that the SDG goals wouldn't actually be achievable in 2030 and would be pushed out even further. What is that looking like now in terms of the goals that had been set for 2030, which is just 8 years away? How far ahead now are those goals being pushed out?
I don't want to say that I know the exact numbers for that, but I do want to acknowledge that, every projection we've seen, every global report that has come out in recent times, including, the state of food insecurity and nutrition that was just released, they're all sort of very stark reminders that these goals we will be increasingly further and further away from these goals if we don't, act swiftly, put more resources on the table. So, I'm very concerned. I'm very, very concerned. And I think the Ukraine situation is particularly concerning because, it's unlike anything that, one has seen in recent times, because it's affecting food production, it's affecting food distribution channels, it's affecting a whole range of things that are about very basic food security, very basic foods, and their production, transport, and movement around the world. Their prices are being deeply affected, and without a clear view of, when and where and how is this going to end. So, I think we will continue to keep eyes on projections and other such things, but it doesn't look pretty right now.
I'm going to switch back a little bit to the pandemic. Any observations on successful interventions that could maybe be applied in this situation? What is the story kind of emerging in terms of tackling malnutrition during the pandemic?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. Firstly, we know that a lot of what we see as visible malnutrition, especially what we measure as, child malnutrition, et cetera, is affected by what happens in terms of food systems. It's affected by what happens in health systems, and it's really affected by what happens in society, especially around the lives of girls and women. And what we saw during the pandemic was that every system took a hit, right? And there was a shock to every single system, in the sense that the economic systems that underpin whether families have enough money to buy and purchase foods that they want to eat, that took substantial hits. Health systems took huge hits. We know there were major disruptions to the provision of routine healthcare, and certainly because the educational systems took hits. We know that there were girls who were falling out of school. There was likely early marriages happening, early pregnancies, all of which sort of affect how children grow and thrive, which is what we measure in different surveys and other things. But I think what we also saw through the pandemic was really at the end of the day, fairly substantial efforts that many governments around the world, including, the government of India, governments across South Asia, state governments in India, subnational entities, there just was the sense that more has to be done. And so there were, deployments of new social protection instruments. There were efforts made to bring back routine health systems. And so, when you sort of look at the full spectrum of that, I think there are many bright spots in the context of what happened in a very dark time, really, in human history, right? The pandemic is something we're all going to be looking back at and learning from and trying to interpret for years to come. But the questions of whether those were enough, whether the hit that societies took is, has made a big difference. I actually don't think we're going to know about that for some years to come. It's a little bit like, what happened in World War II and the Dutch famine, for example. There was a period of time when the blockades led to very intense food insecurity, which in turn contributed to a very long-term impacts on human health. People have studied the effects of those short 9 months of food blockades on genetic imprinting of non-communicable diseases, on malnutrition outcomes, on long-term health outcomes for years and years and years to come. And that's one thing that we don't know yet with the pandemic. We know that perhaps governments were able to deploy some food security programs a few months in, that, people were able to be helped in some ways, but the full extent of the impact, and it's impacts of all kinds, because there's, traumas, there's, missed vaccinations, there was probably missed antenatal care visits, pregnancy care visits, food insecurity and nutritional shortages at very critical periods of the life course. We will know the impacts of these for some many years to come, I think. So I really hope, given what we know about, what happened in the past, that researchers around the world will pay attention to this, that we will not forget to continue to examine the impacts of the pandemic on society, on lives and livelihoods and health.
Any particular public policy instruments that come to mind when you think of the sort of measures that were implemented? I think social protection writ large, and the variations of social protection. So, across South Asia, for example, we saw different approaches to social protection. India, for example, took a food-based approach to social protection. So there was a lot of, you have a large national social safety net scheme that reaches, very, very large numbers of people across the country. So, more food grains and other things were added into that. In different states, they deployed that, and they topped up and added more. I think in Pakistan, they deployed their, as the SAS program, the social safety net program. So I think what countries did was take the programs and platforms that were available and then, add on, top up, extend benefits. And that's really all you can do when you're in a situation of crisis, right? You can't necessarily build a whole new program. What you can do is take existing efforts and then sort of innovate and add around it. And we saw this also with health and nutrition programs. So, for example, in India, technology was fairly strongly integrated into several parts of the nutrition and health systems. Frontline workers had access to technology, for example. And, we found in research that we and other people did that they were able to deploy all of those tools to kind of reach people. If they couldn't go to their homes, they would try to reach them on the phones. They would try to deliver critical services different ways. If the health centers were closed, or if the community nutrition centers were closed, services were being, literally delivered to the doorstep. So I think what you saw was that,
across, certainly across the region, there was a lot of innovation happening around the use of base programs.
So what are you most optimistic about from this picture?
I shouldn't pause that long, should I? But like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think because the SDGs were, in a sense, are goals that are owned by so many. They're not just owned by a few. I think there's very large scale awareness of how important those goals are, how important actions, to tackle those goals are. And so there is that sense that, we need to keep our eyes on it. There was a lot happening before the pandemic hit to, for example, for nutrition. There just was this tremendous groundswell. And I don't want to say just, in India or the region, but around the world, we've had leaders who have understood the problem, who have made commitments, who have put resources to it. We had, people from across society, whether it was researchers, technocrats, business leaders, who recognize the importance of a challenge such as nutrition. And I think that gives me optimism, because it basically says there's a lot of people who recognize the importance of working on it. And yes, the pandemic was really like a big fat disruption, a big fat interruption. But you can't move forward on trying to solve a problem if people aren't aligned around the importance of that problem. And on that front, I am optimistic. We have really at many, many, many different levels and all through society a very deep recognition that malnutrition, food security, hunger are really important societal problems for all of us to be paying attention to. And what we need to do as we look forward is for every person in sort of every place of power in society to find what they can do now and to sort of tackle the problem that we've all agreed is really important to solve, right? I wouldn't say we were at this level of problem acceptance and problem recognition, maybe even 5-7 years ago. And so that gives me optimism, right? You can today talk to somebody and say, hey, what are you doing about nutrition? And you don't need to explain what nutrition is. You don't need to explain why it's important. You don't need to explain the importance of tackling early childhood nutrition for, the well-being of society. You can start the conversation in a very different place. You can already start to talk about solutions. And it may sound like that's not a big deal, but this is a really big deal. Getting whole of society and people at every level aligned around the importance of tackling a problem is no small feat. It has taken many people many years of work, to get us where we are. I think it's incredible that the White House this year will be hosting a conference on nutrition, food security, and health in the US. It's incredible. That's going to happen in September. It is, again, a very, important reminder of the recognition of that set of problems, even for a country such as the United States. And it's going to have a global impact, right? In a good way, I hope. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm optimistic about.
I think something that you've also touched on in previous discussions has been looking at the full spectrum of nutrition. So while we are very concerned about malnutrition today, we are also thinking about issues on the other end of the spectrum, which is a rise in obesity amongst adolescents. Any thoughts on that, particularly over the pandemic, where we've seen kind of both ends of the spectrum of being affected?
Yeah, so many thoughts. Well, it is incredible to be sitting in a place like South Asia, which for decades, in a sense, has been talked about as your vision is of thin, skinny, hungry people, and it's a little frightening to be here today and to realize that we have in this region the full spectrum of nutrition challenges, right? I mean, all the way from the undernutrition and food insecurity challenges that we've typically thought about, and also the non-communicable diseases and the overweight and the obesity, and it's really. But I think where I sit on that is that in a sense the root cause of many of those challenges of malnutrition, whether it's on the undernutrition side or on the overweight and non-communicable side, lies in food. It lies in what's happening to diets and to food systems and to the accessibility of healthy, nutritious diets for people. And in a sense, I would say in an earlier world, maybe, the people who worked on undernutrition were thinking differently about solutions than the people who were working on overweight and obesity. And here again, I just think we've come to a point of confluence of our understanding where, regardless of the form of malnutrition that you focus on in your research or that a government focuses on in terms of policy, just a very deep recognition that diets and food are really central to solving this challenge. It doesn't make the challenge easier to solve because I think we're also sort of sitting at a point in history where you're seeing dramatic increases in food prices. You're seeing the research is emerging from our institute and from others on the how many people can absolutely not afford even basic nutritious diets. But I think the recognition of the importance of that really puts the onus on everyone to say, okay, what are we going to do to really further this understanding of the centrality of diets and of making sure that nutritious foods are going to be available, affordable, accessible to people around the world. And I think, for example, again, going back to, for example, the White House conference, I know that that's going to be a big topic, big part of the focus of the conference as well. How do we make nutritious diets affordable, accessible, in that case to all Americans? But I think every national government should be thinking and working precisely towards those goals because it has implications for both sides of the spectrum of malnutrition across the board.
I think what I'm hearing from you is that the pandemic has not been a lost opportunity. There's been a lot of learnings, or do you think we haven't really taken what we needed to from the pandemic to ensure and shore up systems?
It's a little bit of both, right? It really is a little bit of both. I think it brought people together. Many people in the global nutrition community were already working together on a range of different things. But the pandemic brought people together even more closely and with, even more of a focus on the urgency of tackling the situation, across, the sort of global entities working on nutrition and counterparts in many different countries. For example, there's the Standing Together for Nutrition movement, which has been trying to sort of keep our eyes on the ball in terms of, what the pandemic impacts have been. At the same time, and of course, we've learned a lot. The evidence is accumulating, but perhaps not fast enough. My worry at some level is that people will forget the pandemic because at a human level, we want to forget the pandemic. We want to ignore and move away from all that it did to people's lives, including all of our lives. But we just can't look away. It's still there. The after effects of the pandemic are still there. And so, I want to see us keep our focus on it, to recognize that the impacts of the pandemic are still flowing through our societies, but that we can, and we've all learned a lot through it. We've learned about the impacts of it on economies, on health systems, on food systems. We need to make sure that never happens again. We haven't learned yet everything we need to learn about the actual impacts of it on, how children grow or, those other things. We still need to learn about that. So, we still have to keep our eyes on that ball. I worry, I think it's, our attention is fleeting. The pandemic waves continue to roll through society. But, we have political upheavals around the world. We have, the Ukraine war. We have, all kinds of things happening that are adding layers of urgency to already tenuous situations. And so, I worry that people will sort of really come to a point of, wow, there's just too much going on here, and we don't know what to try to solve. But I think it's really important for us to keep our eyes on the most vulnerable. I worry the most about the people that are left behind, around the world, whether it's in South Asia, whether it's in the US. And so, I think as researchers, as, people who support advocates with knowledge and with research, I think it is really incumbent on us to keep a very, very close eye on the most vulnerable, so that, they don't get lost. Actions to support the most vulnerable don't get lost in what is a really dizzying scenario of the news cycle.
Absolutely. I think that, one piece of data that did come out was that the Azim Premji Institute predicted that 200 million people in India have fallen back into poverty as a result of the pandemic. So that's just one piece of data.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, what we need is also, we need governments to be, to be comfortable with data. And this is, honestly, this is a huge challenge. And it's not a challenge that is restricted to any one country or, any one context. The world we see ahead of us is going, and the data that, researchers and national surveys and other sort of data gathering agencies pulled together is going to force all of society to face uncomfortable facts. And part of acting, to support and improve the lives of the most vulnerable requires us to acknowledge the data. It requires us to put data out in public, to engage with it, to face uncomfortable facts, and then figure out what we're going to do to change those facts, right? Not to change the story about those facts, but to actually change those, to do things so that the next time that data is collected, you see a better situation. But, data is very political. Things such as food security, hunger, malnutrition have become more political. And in a sense, that's the price we pay for people beginning to pay attention to the problem, right? So yeah, there's a lot of work cut out for all of us, I think, in this, for the media, for researchers, for advocates. Facts are going to be very important to continue to pay attention to and highlight.
Yes, that's very interesting about the greater awareness generally, and that's a big achievement in the field. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and ask you about your own post as a nutritionist, about your own dietary habits.
Oh dear. Okay, so firstly, no bad foods and no superfoods. I don't believe either that there are terrible foods or that there are superfoods. I believe very much in patterns, healthy patterns of eating, and that, good patterns of eating can include, all kinds of foods in them. So for me, it's very much about routine. I'm a creature of routine. I like my 3 meals. I like to eat them within fairly, narrow windows of time. Lunch at 1, dinner between 7 and 8, and I don't snack a lot in between. try to exercise a little every day. The WHO says we should be exercising about 150 minutes a week. I'm not sure I get to that all the time. But I think what we've learned over time about diets and longevity and all of that is that it's very much about the long-term patterns of living and eating that we set up for ourselves. And I come from a military family, and I think there's a lot of I have seen throughout my life a lot of discipline and routine and food and eating, all the way from my grandfather to my parents. And I think that's something that I really take away, both as a professional and at a personal level, that what we do over long periods of time is really what, puts us in a good place for a long and healthy life. Food is pleasure, food is culture, food is, central to how we meet, interact, and are as human beings. And we have to embrace all of that when we eat, and so even though as a nutritionist, I do look for color on my plate, I certainly am not one of those nutritionists who's going to deny herself, all the pleasures that come from food. I hope that's enough. No bad foods, no superfoods. That's it.
What do you think of the plant-based foods?
More plants are. Yeah, do you mean the sort of meat replacement types of things? Again, I think people have to find and eat what works for them, and within their cultural, ethical, gastronomical, and other sort of and the attributes and things that they value in foods. I've certainly tried some of the plant-based foods. Happy to include them in my diet every once in a while, but in general, I tend to consume sort of less processed foods. So if I'm going to eat plant-based foods, I'll just eat a lot of veggies or beans or whatever. Have never been one for sort of replacement products, if you will. But that's just, that's again just a personal choice. And frankly, for me, I think that just comes from a gastronomical perspective than anything else. If I'm going to eat something, I'd rather eat the real food and eat, less of it, perhaps.
That's fantastic.
I'm not going to ask you what you eat, Neeta, so I'll spare you that one.
Yeah, it's and my diet has been evolving over the pandemic, but that's for another day. Thank you so much for being with us today. That was very insightful, and we look forward to hearing more from you on nutrition.
Yeah, and all I can say is more color on your plate, more color on everyone's plate is a really good thing for all of us to aim for. And while it sounds easy, I think what we know is that putting that on, within reach of the world's population is such a big challenge for us. And I think we're all really trying to commit to, to doing whatever we can to help get us there.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.